By the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany's war against the Soviet Union had already claimed millions of lives. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion launched in June 1941, had pushed deep into Soviet territory, but had failed to deliver the swift knockout blow Germany's leadership had expected. The brutal winter of 1941 had stopped German forces just short of Moscow. Now, in 1942, Hitler shifted his ambitions southward toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and a city on the banks of the Volga River that carried enormous symbolic weight, Stalingrad. The city's name alone made it a target of obsession for both dictators involved. Named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, capturing it promised Hitler a devastating propaganda victory, while losing it was unthinkable to Stalin for the same reason. Beyond symbolism, Stalingrad held real strategic value as an industrial center and a critical transport hub along the Volga, a vital artery for Soviet oil and supplies moving north. Germany's Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, led the assault, supported by the 4th Panzer Army and hundreds of thousands of Axis troops, including Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces covering the flanks. The German offensive, part of the larger Case Blue campaign, began advancing toward the city in August 1942. On August 23, the Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing campaign against Stalingrad, reducing much of the city to rubble and killing an estimated 40,000 civilians in a single day, though precise figures remain difficult to verify, given the chaos of the time. What followed was some of the most brutal urban combat in military history. German forces expected the shattered city to fall quickly, but Soviet defenders, under General Vasily Chuikov, transformed the ruins into a battlefield perfectly suited to grinding close-quarters warfare. Stalin's Order No. 227, issued in July 1942, had declared not one step back, threatening severe punishment for retreat without orders, a brutal policy that stiffened Soviet resistance regardless of cost. Fighting inside Stalingrad soon earned the grim nickname Rattenkrieg, or War of the Rats, among German soldiers. Combat collapsed into brutal close-range struggles for individual buildings, floors, and even single rooms. Soviet and German soldiers sometimes occupied different floors of the same structure, fighting through walls, ceilings, and stairwells. The ruined grain elevator, the Red October factory, and the apartment block known as Pavlov's house became infamous battlegrounds, changing hands repeatedly amid constant shelling and hand-to-hand combat. Pavlov's house, in particular, became legendary. A small group of Soviet soldiers, led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, fortified an apartment building and held it for nearly 2 months against repeated German assaults, a defense so tenacious that German maps reportedly marked it as a fortress. Soviet snipers also became feared figures amid the rubble, with Vasily Zaitsev emerging as one of the most famous marksmen of the war, credited with dozens of confirmed kills, his exploits later fueling both wartime propaganda and enduring post-war legend. By November 1942, German forces controlled roughly 90% of the city, pushing Soviet defenders into narrow pockets along the Volga's western bank. Yet this apparent success proved to be a trap of Germany's own making. Fighting for every ruined building had ground the Sixth Army into a static, exhausted force, deeply entangled within the city and increasingly vulnerable along its extended and thinly defended flanks, where weaker Axis Allied units held the line. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet High Command launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive planned in careful secrecy by Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. Rather than striking the exhausted German forces directly inside Stalingrad, Soviet armies attacked the vulnerable Romanian and Hungarian units guarding the flanks north and south of the city. These weaker Axis formations, lacking sufficient armor and anti-tank weapons, collapsed under the assault. Within 4 days, Soviet forces linked up near the town of Kalach, encircling the entire German Sixth Army along with attached units, trapping an estimated 250,000 to 290,000 Axis soldiers inside what became known as the Kessel, or cauldron. Port aircraft could deliver only a fraction of the roughly 700 tons of supplies the trapped army needed each day, and Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns took a heavy toll on the resupply flights. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies dwindled rapidly. Soldiers inside the pocket began suffering from starvation, frostbite, and disease as temperatures plunged well below freezing. Horses were slaughtered for food, and reports of soldiers eating leather and worse circulated among survivors, a grim measure of how desperate conditions had become. In December 1942, German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a relief operation, codenamed Operation Winterstorm, driving toward the encircled Sixth Army from the southwest. Manstein's forces came within roughly 30 miles of the trapped troops before Soviet resistance and dwindling German strength halted the advance. Paulus, bound by Hitler's orders to hold position, did not attempt to break out and link up with the relief force, a decision that has been debated by historians ever since as potentially the last realistic chance to save the encircled army. By January 1943, the trapped German forces were starving, freezing, and nearly out of ammunition. Soviet forces launched Operation Ring in mid-January, systematically crushing the pocket and splitting it into smaller, increasingly desperate segments. On January 30, 1943, in a symbolic gesture, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of field marshal, reportedly hoping the honor would compel him to fight to the death or take his own life, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus chose survival instead. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of his forces to the Red Army. The northern remnant, still resisting, surrendered on February 2nd. In total, roughly 91,000 German and Axis soldiers were taken prisoner, emaciated and barely able to walk, the pitiful remains of what had once been a formidable army of over 280,000 men. The scale of loss was staggering. Estimates suggest the battle claimed somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million total casualties among both Axis and Soviet forces, including soldiers and civilians, making it among the deadliest single battles in human history, though precise figures remain difficult to establish given wartime chaos and incomplete records. For the German prisoners taken at Stalingrad, captivity brought its own horrors. Sent to Soviet labor camps, they endured brutal conditions, and historians estimate that only about 5,000 to 6,000 of the roughly 91,000 captured soldiers ultimately survived to return home, some not until the mid-1950s, years after the war had ended. The defeat at Stalingrad marked an unmistakable turning point in the European war. It shattered the myth of German military invincibility that had dominated the war's early years, and represented the first major, unrecoverable defeat suffered by Hitler's forces on the Eastern Front. German public morale, carefully managed by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, suffered a severe blow, even as Goebbels attempted to spin the defeat into a tale of heroic sacrifice through his infamous total war speech delivered weeks later in Berlin. For the Soviet Union, victory at Stalingrad came at horrific cost, but it fundamentally shifted the momentum of the war on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces, having proven they could not only halt but destroy an entire German field army, began a long, grinding advance westward that would eventually carry the Red Army all the way to Berlin by 1945. The battle also elevated the reputations of Soviet commanders like Zhukov, who would go on to play a central role in subsequent major offensives throughout the remainder of the war. Stalingrad's significance extended well beyond its immediate military outcome. It demonstrated the immense industrial and manpower resources the Soviet Union could bring to bear despite the catastrophic losses of 1941, and it forced German military planners into an increasingly defensive posture on the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war. Combined with the Allied victories in North Africa and the looming threat of a second front in Western Europe, Stalingrad signaled to the world that the tide of the war had begun to turn decisively against Nazi Germany. Today, the site of the battle, in the city now known as Volgograd, is home to one of the largest war memorials in the world, the Motherland Call statue, standing as a towering monument to the immense sacrifice made there. Stalingrad remains one of history's starkest illustrations of total war, a battle in which ideology, industrial capacity, and sheer human endurance collided amid the ruins of a single city, ultimately determining the course of the 20th century's deadliest conflict.